The Servant Girl Annihilator. 3 years before Jack the Ripper terrorized the streets of London, a killer was already stalking the dark, unpaved streets of another growing city, an ocean away. He struck at night, always near the full moon, entering homes silently while families slept just feet away. By the time he stopped, 8 people were dead. To this day, no one knows who he was. This is the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator, a case historians now consider among the earliest documented serial killings in American history. In the early 1880s, Austin, Texas was transforming. Only a couple of decades earlier, it had been a rough frontier town of a few thousand people. By 1884, it was fast becoming the political and cultural center of Texas, home to a new state capital under construction and a growing university. Wealthy families built new homes across the city, and many employed domestic servants, most of them young black women, only a generation removed from slavery, who cooked, cleaned, and lived in small servants' quarters behind their employers' houses. It was these women and the modest homes they lived in that a killer began targeting in the final days of 1884. On the night of December 30th, 1884, 25-year-old Molly Smith was asleep in the servants' quarters behind the home of her employer on West Pecan Street. Sometime after midnight, an intruder struck her in the head with an axe while she slept, then dragged her out into the backyard, where she was raped and left dead in the snow. Her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, who had been sleeping beside her, was also struck and severely injured, though he survived. Police initially suspected Spencer himself, and he was arrested and tried for Molly's murder. After a 2-day trial, he was acquitted. Whoever had actually killed her was still out there. For a few months, nothing happened. Then, in early May 1885, the violence returned. On May 7th, Eliza Shelley, a mother of 3 working as a cook for a local doctor's family, was killed in her home on Cypress Street. She was struck in the head with an axe with such force that her skull was nearly split apart. 16 days later, on May 23rd, a third servant, Irene Cross, was attacked on East Linden Street. She was stabbed and slashed so severely around the head that a reporter who saw her body afterward described it as looking almost as though she had been scalped. By now, the city understood it was dealing with more than isolated tragedies. Newspapers began referring to the killings as the Austin Axe Murders. Then, in a letter to a friend, a young Austin resident named William Sidney Porter, better known today by his pen name, O. Henry, coined a darker, almost theatrical nickname, describing the killer's nighttime raids as the work of a servant girl annihilator. The name spread through the press and stuck for well over a century. For the next 2 months, Austin held its breath. No new attacks were reported through June and July, and for a while it seemed possible the killings might be over. They were not. In August 1885, the violence resumed with new intensity. A servant named Clara Dick survived a brutal attack. Then, on the night of August 30th, an intruder broke into the home where 50-year-old Rebecca Ramey worked, knocking her unconscious before dragging her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, out to a nearby washhouse. Mary was raped and killed, an iron rod driven through her skull. She remains the youngest known victim in the case. Barely a month later, on September 28th, the killer struck again, this time targeting a young couple. 20-year-old Gracie Vance and 25-year-old Orange Washington were sleeping in servants' quarters behind their employer's home when they were attacked with an axe. 2 friends staying nearby, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson, were also assaulted, but survived. Gracie and Orange did not. One newspaper described her injuries as almost unrecognizable. By this point, panic had settled over Austin's black community in particular, since every victim so far had been black. Families began keeping candles burning through the night, and some residents openly wondered whether the killer might be something other than human, given how completely he seemed to move through the city undetected. Vigilante patrols formed. Hundreds of men were questioned or arrested on suspicion. Over the course of the year, none were ever convicted for these killings. Then, On Christmas Eve, 1885, the pattern that had defined the case for a full year suddenly broke. That night, 2 women were murdered within roughly an hour of each other in 2 entirely different parts of the city. And for the first time, both victims were white. Susan Hancock, described by one reporter as one of Austin's most refined women, was found in the backyard of her home, her skull split open by an axe, with something thin and sharp driven through her ear into her brain. Not long after, 17-year-old Eula Phillips was found dead in the yard behind her in-laws' home, killed in a similar fashion and sexually assaulted. Her husband, Jimmy Phillips, had also been injured in the attack, though he survived. The murders of 2 white women, one of them from a socially prominent family, triggered a reaction the previous 8 months of violence against black victims never had. Austin's elite demanded immediate answers. Extra police were brought in. And for reasons that remain debated by historians to this day, the killings simply stopped. No further Servant Girl Annihilator murders were ever reported in Austin again. In the aftermath, suspicion turned inward, toward the victim's own husbands. Moses Hancock was arrested for his wife Susan's murder and tried before a hung jury failed to convict him. Jimmy Phillips was arrested for Eula's murder, and in a stunning turn, was actually found guilty at trial. That conviction was overturned within the year, with an appeals court citing insufficient evidence. Neither man was ever convicted, and investigators were left with the unsettling likelihood that the same killer responsible for the earlier attacks on black servants had also killed 2 white women that same night, despite months of assumptions that the killer was specifically targeting black victims. Other suspects emerged and faded over the following months. A young black man named Nathan Elgin drew police attention after a bizarre incident in which he seized a woman from a local saloon and dragged her away. Officers shot him, and he died of his wounds the following day. Investigators noted that footprints found at several crime scenes appeared to belong to someone missing toes on one foot, a detail some believed matched Elgin, though the connection was never conclusively proven, and the killings had, by most accounts, already stopped by the time he died. A separate and more elusive theory centered on a cook known only as Maurice, who worked at the Pearl House, a boarding establishment connected to several of the victims through their employment history. According to some accounts, Maurice left Austin for New Orleans and eventually London not long before the murders ceased for good, a detail that decades later would fuel speculation linking the Austin killings to the Jack the Ripper murders that began in London just under 3 years afterward. No solid evidence has ever confirmed that connection, and most historians treat it as coincidence rather than proof. What makes the Servant Girl Annihilator case so unusual, beyond its brutality, is how thoroughly it seemed to vanish from public memory almost as quickly as it happened. Unlike Jack the Ripper, whose crimes would become one of the most examined cold cases in history, Austin's killings faded from national attention within a few years, overshadowed by London's murders, and, historians argue, by the racial dynamics of the era, in which violence against black victims often received far less sustained investigation or public outcry than violence against white victims. It took modern researchers, decades later, to properly reconstruct the case as what it almost certainly was: one continuous killing spree, carried out by the same person or people across an entire year, rather than a series of unrelated local tragedies. Investigative journalist Skip Hollinsworth's research into the case helped re-establish it in the public record as one of the earliest documented examples of an American serial killer, predating the term itself by decades. More than 140 years later, the identity of the Servant Girl Annihilator remains unknown. No physical evidence survives that could be tested with modern forensic techniques. The victims, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Orange Washington, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips, are buried in cemeteries scattered around a city that has changed almost beyond recognition since 1885. Several of the addresses where they died now sit beneath the buildings of modern downtown Austin, including the grounds of the Four Seasons Hotel and the Austin Central Library. What remains is a case that helped define a pattern investigators would only fully understand generations later. A single offender moving quietly through a city at night, exploiting exactly the kind of victims least likely, in that era, to receive a thorough investigation. Whether he was ever questioned and released, whether he left Austin for another city under a different name, or whether he simply stopped for reasons no one will ever know, the man behind Austin's first true crime wave was never identified. The moonlit nights that once sent the city into panic are today mostly forgotten. But somewhere in that history remains an open case. One of the oldest unsolved serial killings on American record, and one that, more than a century later, has still never been closed.